We're very excited to welcome Professor Rajiv Sethi from Barnard College, Columbia University, for our April Colloquium talk. He's a professor of economics and an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute as well. He's previously held positions at Microsoft Research New York City, the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, and other places. He's on the editorial boards for the AER and Economics and Philosophy. His current research deals with information and beliefs, including how stereotypes affect interactions among strangers, especially related to the criminal justice system and crime, which is what he's going to be talking about today. He's also part of a large interdisciplinary team working on forecasting of geopolitical events using methods that combine machine learning models and human judgment. He's a founding member of CORE, which is the Curriculum Open Access Resources for Economics, which is a group of scholars engaged in the production of high quality, freely available resources for teaching economics. And we've heard about his work from many of the speakers in the past at MD4SG, so we're very excited to welcome him today. His talk is going to be on the geography of lethal force. All right.
Okay, thanks very much for that kind introduction and for having me on. This is, I think, my first live streamed online colloquium, so happy to do it and happy to meet you all. So I'm going to just share my screen and move to the slides. And please interrupt me at any time, so I'm happy to take questions as we proceed. I will be presenting work that's a combination of material that's sort of about to be published and some that's very preliminary, which really hasn't, we don't even have in working paper form yet. And I just want to mention two of my co-authors, Dan O'Flaherty, with whom I have a book coming out next week or the week after next, and Pepe Montiel-Olia, with whom we are doing some more recent work that's related to this topic of lethal force. So let me start by showing you some data from The Guardian. So this is from The Guardian newspaper, which has been collecting and collating lethal force incidents throughout the United States. And these are results for 2015 and 2016. And you see that there are about 1,100 incidents.
Oh, excuse me. We can't see your screen. I don't know if you're sharing your screen already.
Oh, I see. Let me try again. Oh, I see. I need to just, okay. Yeah, okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, okay, good, sorry. So, so this,
see your screen.
Can you see the screen now?
No. What,
no.
Actually, my live chat seems to, well, my
Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
I think if you click on Rajiv,
Well,
no.
Yep. My live chat seems to, well, my
Can you see the screen now?
I think there might be some feedback from people who are both on the call and watching on the live stream at the same time, since there's a little delay there. And I think if you click on Rajiv, just click and unclick a few times, you should be able to see the screen.
So just let me know when I should continue.
You should go ahead.
You can continue. Yeah.
Should I go ahead?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so what I was saying is this is joint work with Dan O'Flaherty and Pepe Montiel-Olia, and I'll describe the various projects as I get through the presentation. So here's some data from the Guardian newspaper, and they have been collecting lethal force incidents in the United States, and this is for 2015 and 2016. And on the left-hand side, you see there are about 1,100 or so lethal force incidents. So these are people who are killed by a police officer in the United States in these 2 years. And then on the right of the screen, you see a breakdown of the race and ethnicity of the victims. And roughly speaking, you see that the highest incidence, the highest exposure is among African Americans and Native Americans in the United States, whites and Asians with the least exposure, and Latinos somewhere in the middle. And that's true in both of these years, although there's a bit of shuffling around. So why are we looking at data from The Guardian? That's because there's no official data for this, or no reliable and complete official data in the United States. And this is something that James Comey a few years ago described as ridiculous and embarrassing. But that's starting to change now. But really, the only data that we have on lethal force incidents is from media sources. So the Washington Post has a database, so does The Guardian, and a couple of other sources that I'll mention in due course. And they give you roughly consistent estimates, about 1,000 to 1,100 killed a year, depending on how you count and classify. And if you compare this internationally, in Germany and in the UK, together you get about 10 a year with little fluctuation. And if you want to compare the population, so the US is about 2.5 times as large as far as population is concerned than Germany and the UK combined. So there's an order of magnitude difference in the exposure to lethal force in the US. So this is quite well known, but it's become much more salient as we've got better data and more attention to this issue in the United States. Now, lethal force is sometimes justified, and the federal standard, at least, provides a fairly narrow set of circumstances under which it's justified. The officer has to believe or have probable cause to believe that the suspect poses a threat to the officer himself or herself, or to somebody else, some third party. And in the United States, officers do face significant threats. So about 50 officers a year are killed in the line of duty, on average over the past decade or so. And again, you see the same type of international differences. So in the UK, there were 3 over a 5-year period, 2010 to 14. Germany, about the same number. And so you get this huge difference also in the risks that officers face. So one thing we're going to have to look at is whether these two things are connected, causally connected. So I'll talk about that a bit later. Now, with regard to the racial disparities in exposure to lethal force, I mentioned already that the Black civilian victimization rate is 2.5 times that of whites. In the popular discourse in the United States, there are 2 hypotheses that are advanced to account for this that are quite different and based on different types of evidence. So one might be called the fear hypothesis. And the fear hypothesis is, roughly speaking, of the following form: that people have negative stereotypes, especially when they are interacting with strangers who are Black and male, and this affects threat perceptions, that an exact same situation that involves different groups is perceived differently because of stereotypes that people hold, and stereotypes about which they might themselves be very imperfectly aware. And the evidence for the fear hypothesis comes from experimental results, especially in social psychology, and I'll talk a bit about that. From anecdotal evidence, so viral videos from dash cams and bystander videos for videos of police killings, and then some historical evidence actually from the 1960s that seems to support the fear hypothesis. And then there's a totally different explanation, or people have advanced a totally different explanation for this substantial racial disparity, which we might call the contact hypothesis, and that's based on statistical evidence. And basically, the argument says that, look, the bias, if there's any bias, it's arriving at the level of contacts. When, roughly speaking, if you use, let's say, arrest as a measure of contact, African Americans face about 2.5 times the likelihood of arrest. And, given any contact, the evidence for bias in the actual exercise of lethal force is limited. And this is an argument that's being made by a couple of economists, and I'll talk about that argument also. And these are 2 very different sources of evidence. So we need to try to think about, how can they be reconciled? How can both be true at the same time? And that's something I'd like to just discuss a bit. So let's quickly just review the psychological literature. And here you may be familiar with this, so I'll just go through very fast. So one of the approaches that's been taken, sort of revolutionized cognitive psychology in the 1990s, was the implicit association test, where people, instead of asking people about their stereotypes by saying, well, what do you think of this group or that group on a survey, a test was designed called the implicit association test that tried to get at associations in people's minds that they might not even themselves be aware of. And there's a very nice recent book by Mazreen Banerjee and Anthony Greenwald, two of the innovators or developers of this test, that describes the methodology. I'll just describe it very, very briefly with an example. So here's something, and you can go to a website called Project Implicit. It's a Harvard University website, and you can actually take a look at a whole bunch of such tests and do them if you like. Now, this is the race IIT. So the race IIT basically asks experimental subjects to conduct 4 classification tasks. that are pretty straightforward. So the first task, you know, if you look at the top two rows on this slide, the first task requires them to just classify faces as African American or European American. So they just have to click a different key on a keyboard with, let's say, the left hand if the face on their screen is African American, and the right hand if it's of a European American child. And that's an easy task. Most people can do it without any trouble. Then they're asked the second task just to classify words as pleasant or unpleasant. So on the screen, you'll see words like, you know, smile, sincere, hatred, vomit, you know, tragedy, crash, etc. And you just got to, you know, use one hand to, if it's pleasant, and the other hand if it's unpleasant. And then here's where the innovation was really creative in the 1990s. You're told that you'll get either a face or a word, and you use one hand if it's an African American child or a pleasant word, and the other hand if it's a European American child or an unpleasant word. So these are, you know, you don't know whether it's a word or a face, but you've got to use one hand for one particular pairing and the other hand for the other pairing. And finally, the last task just reverses the pairing. So you have to choose one hand if it's an African American child with a pleasant word. Pleasant I said last time, so unpleasant word, and European American with a pleasant word. And what's measured in these tests is the reaction time. How quickly can you do these classification tasks? And the key statistic that's used is the difference in reaction time when you have a pairing of an African American face with a pleasant word versus a pairing of an African American face with an unpleasant word. So, you know, the idea being that if there's an implicit association in your mind, it will be revealed by differences in reaction times. And I'll show you the results in just a second. So, but the test, the IAT that's most relevant to what I'm talking about is called the race weapons IAT. And here you see faces of adults, not children. They could be black or white. And the pairing is with either weapons or harmless objects. So you want to look at the reaction time when black faces are paired with weapons versus the reaction time when black faces are paired with harmless objects. And notice that the weapons are archaic weapons. They're not sort of modern, you know, pistols and so on. These are sort of muskets and cannons and so on. The idea being that, you know, things that you've seen in the media or on movies are not going to be really affecting your choices. That's the idea. So very quickly, here are the results. So Banerjee and Greenwald they report results from many of these tests that about 80% of whites and Asians are faster in what they call the congruent block. So what's the congruent block? That's the pairing where the European American faces are paired with the pleasant words and the African American faces are paired with the unpleasant words. People seem to be doing that task faster, significantly faster statistically, although, you know, in terms of milliseconds, it's not that much difference. And about 1/3 of black subjects actually show exactly the same what they interpret as being pro-white implicit association. And they interpret that as showing a bias of some kind towards culturally dominant groups, not necessarily your own group, but a group that is culturally dominant. And in the weapon IAT, you see something similar. 70% have greater difficulty with the white weapon pairing, and the largest effect is with whites and Asians, but also the effect also arises among subjects who are themselves African American. So that's the experimental evidence. Very quickly, the anecdotal evidence, the viral videos. So I'm not going to show this video, but it's really, really striking. If you haven't seen it, this is from a traffic stop in 2014. A civilian by the name of LeVar Jones, got into his pickup truck after work, drove around the corner into a gas station, was stopped by an officer, Sean Grubert, who asked him for his license and registration, and he had exited his vehicle without getting his wallet, so he reached back in and got shot at several times. And luckily, it was not fatal, but the civilian is in disbelief and panic, and just basically asking the officer why he's being shot at in a very respectful way. He calls him sir. And the officer at one point realizes he's made a terrible mistake, so he calls for help and so on. But it's a revealing video. It's worth taking a look at. But also interesting is what happened afterwards, which is that the officer in this case was fired, and this is the statement from the South Carolina Department of Public Safety. And he was fired because he reacted to a perceived threat where there was none. Now the statement here doesn't mention the fact that the reaction to the perceived threat was linked to the fact that LeVar Jones was African American and the officer Sean Grubert was white. But the video certainly suggests it that this would not have happened otherwise. It was in broad daylight, clear and unobstructed view, and so on and so forth. There was really no basis, it appears, for this kind of fear. So this is the kind of evidence. I'll give you one more example, and this is a very, very famous case of Philando Castile. who was shot again after a traffic stop in Falcon Heights, Minnesota. And this is the transcript of an interview that the officer gave a day later. And Castile was shot while his girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, was sitting next to him in the passenger seat. And there was a 4-year-old girl in the back seat. And this sort of, and he was licensed to carry a firearm and told the officer that he had one on his in his possession. And the officer panicked and shot him. And this was his statement, which describes the fear. Now, assuming that at least it's partially sincere, it appears that he was in a great deal of fear. He thought he was going to die, was scared, and so on and so forth. Now, again, the question is, well, was this linked to the fact that Philando Castile was African American? There were several people who thought it was, although that report doesn't say so. So Mark Dayton, for example, the governor of Minnesota at the time, said that he wouldn't have been shot if he were white. And Peter Moskos, who's a professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, a former Baltimore police officer himself, he also maintained that, with this cop in this locale, I don't think there's a chance in hell that Castile would have been shot had he been white. So this is, again, sort of anecdotal evidence based on cases for the fear hypothesis. Now, the historical evidence, if you try to think about, the last few decades of U.S. history, about when the incidence of lethal force was highest, you go back to the summer of 1967. There were a huge number of protests in a large number of cities, referred to as race riots, and this was the greatest concentration of police killings, really, in recent history. In Newark and Detroit alone, about 50 civilians were killed in just a few days. And if you look at the Guardian data right now, it's about half a dozen in 2 years. So that's a huge difference in the rate of killing for these two particular cities. And they weren't the only ones. Many of the people killed were women, children, elderly, who were just standing by windows or trying to protect their children. And so there was a huge amount of indiscriminate fire. And President Lyndon Johnson established the Kerner Commission to try to look at, well, what happened, to investigate this, the causes of the disturbances and the use of force during them. And the Kerner report, it was published in 1968, and it's also worth reading. It talks a lot about exaggerated fear based on erroneous reports of sniper fire. So what the guardsmen, National Guardsmen and police officers who were brought in to deal with these protests, what they feared most of all was sniper fire from tall buildings, especially public housing projects. And they, sometimes an officer would fire a gunshot and it would be interpreted as fire coming from civilians, and then there would be indiscriminate fire, which would then lead to a lot of fatalities. So that's what the commission found, that a climate of fear and expectation of violence created totally erroneous reports, resulting in overreaction and excessive use of force. So this is, again, evidence for the fear hypothesis. But there was one very, very interesting exception to this in Detroit and Newark, actually in Detroit at that time, and that's also worth keeping in mind as we look at what's going on today. And this was in Detroit. So there was a portion of Detroit that was patrolled by, according to the report, calm, determined, hardened professional soldiers. And these were soldiers that were commanded by someone called General John L. Throckmorton, who was a veteran of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and he basically just approached the task very, very differently. He had his troops basically remove live ammunition from their weapons, tried to restore a sense of normalcy, had more communication and contact with civilians, and just approached it very differently. There were a lot more. There was a lot less firing in total, one casualty in all, and in general, calm and normalcy was restored very, very quickly. The reason I mention this is because it suggests that selection, training, leadership, and organizational culture matter a lot. And we'll see, one of the things that I want to show you is that there are huge differences in the US in the use of lethal force from one law enforcement agency to another. And part of the reason might be something related to what was happening here in Detroit in 1967. So I'll come back to this point later. Okay, now the contact hypothesis. So,
Rajiv,
yeah.
Do you mind clicking the little hide button on the bar at the bottom of your screen? It's covering your slides sometimes.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to the last slide. Yeah, it just says, yeah, they were responsible for one civilian death. Yeah. Okay, so that's the fear hypothesis. So you can see evidence is coming from social psychology, from historical reports, and from the viral videos, the anecdotal evidence from dash cam videos, bystander videos, and so on. Now, there's a very different hypothesis, which we can call the contact hypothesis. And one statement of this was made by the Harvard economist Sendil Mullainathan in 2015 in the New York Times. It's an informal piece, but I'm going to zoom into it, and this is really the way he puts it. So he says, for the entire country, about 29% of arrestees are African American, and if you look at the incidence of lethal force, about 32% of police shooting victims are African Americans. And then he says, if discrimination were a big factor, we would have expected a larger gap. And then he says, this suggests that removing police racial bias will have little effect on the killing rate. And I want to contest this a bit, the inference from arrest rates for a minute, but this is roughly speaking what the contact hypothesis says. It says that, if there's bias, it arises in the level of contact initiation rather than bias once the contact has actually been initiated. So that's a very different approach than the fear hypothesis. He's basically saying that once a contact is initiated, all the stereotypes and all the other beliefs and implicit biases are really not very relevant, at least as far as explaining the data that we see. So what's one potential problem with this approach? So one problem is the following. So the implicit assumption, if you're trying to say that arrest rates and lethal force victimization rates are roughly comparable in magnitude to each other, the likelihood of facing these two things, then you're really treating each arrest, the arrest pool. If you think about an arrest pool that involves black civilians and an arrest pool that involves white civilians, you're saying that these two pools are effectively, objectively threatening to the officer to the same degree. This argument would break down if, for example, one of these pools was much more threatening to the officer than the other pool. Now, why might it be that the pool of black arrestees is less objectively threatening to the officer? Well, one reason might be because it's inflated by a whole bunch of arrests of people that wouldn't be arrested if they were white. So there are three examples on this slide. The Gates arrest on his front porch, Sandra Bland's arrest in Prairie View, Texas, and the Starbucks arrest in Philadelphia. So these are examples of arrests that, again, anecdotal evidence suggests would not have occurred if the people who were being arrested in these situations were white instead of black. And if that's the case, if a whole bunch of folks are getting arrested who are not objectively threatening to the police, then the arrest pool, the folks with whom police are having contact, it includes a whole bunch of people who are not objectively threatening. In that case, you should expect the likelihood of lethal force to be lower for this pool. So if it's the same, that might suggest evidence for bias rather than the absence of bias. So that's one critique that one could make of this kind of reasoning to support the contact hypothesis. So there's another that I'll come to, but this is one thing to keep in mind. Now, to deal with this critique, there was another study, and this is by Roland Fryer, also at Harvard University. And this is a forthcoming paper. So this was a more detailed statistical analysis, and the data that he used, the best data that he had, came from Houston. And he constructed an arrest pool that was specifically designed to represent potentially threatening scenarios or encounters where the police could reasonably suspect that there was a threat to their own safety or that of somebody else. And what he did is he carried out a statistical analysis, basically an econometric analysis, where he controlled for other attributes in this arrest pool, and he came to the same conclusion as Mullainathan, which was basically that that as far as lethal force is concerned, there was no racial bias once the contact had been initiated. And let me just show you a little bit about his data.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in. So I remember when this paper came out with Roland Fryer, and it was, I guess, 3 summers ago or something like this. So I don't actually remember the details of the paper, but I remember at the time there was a lot of discussion about maybe like the validity of the conclusions that he was drawing. Like I remember there was just a lot of discussion. I don't actually remember do you remember any of those discussions, either pro his conclusions or like challenging his conclusions?
Yes, there was a lot of discussion. In fact, I contributed to that discussion. I have a couple of blog posts around that time that tried to argue that there were weaknesses in this analysis. I mean, there were different approaches taken. So one was that, look, the analysis is limited geographically, that Houston may not be representative of the country as a whole. I mean, he did consider a few other law enforcement agencies in 3 states, Florida, Texas, and California. But really, the heart of the analysis is using the data from Houston. But there were also critiques about the way it was conducted, and I'll mention some of it in a minute in the next slide. But yeah, it was very controversial, and it remains very controversial. And I want to argue two things in a minute. One is, there are issues with the study itself, even as a study of Houston. But Houston is very, very special. I want to convince you by the time I'm done with this talk that there's so much variation geographically in the United States that you cannot take any particular region and generalize from that. And I'll give you some data to support that point of view as well. So we can come back to that. But there were a lot of criticisms of this study, and it remains controversial. Yes. So I'm not presenting it as authoritative in any way. I just wanted to be aware of it. That's all.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So if you drill down and look at Fry's data, it does look like, so basically, carrying out the Sendil-Mullainathan type test, he finds that in his arrest pool, the percentage of black civilians is 58%, and in the shooting data, he's got a shooting pool, people who are shot by police, not necessarily fatally. It's 52%. So again, he's actually finding that the arrest pool has a larger share of black civilians than the shooting pool. But he also finds that the two arrestee pools differ substantially. So, in ways that do suggest that the pool of white arrestees was more dangerous, objectively speaking, than the pool of black civilians. So, for instance, in his pool itself, 2/3 of the whites in the arrest pool and 1/2 of the black civilians in the arrest pool attacked or drew weapon. This is one of the categories on which he has data. Now, he claims that controlling for these things, econometrically, does not result in any changes to the inference that you would make from the raw racial differences, and this is where he reaches the conclusion that there was an absence of bias in objectively threatening encounters. Now, it is entirely possible. This is another possible critique. It's entirely possible that in truly threatening encounters, you don't see evidence of bias or much evidence of bias. While at the same time, hello? Can you hear me?
Wani program da na join bari in abin nan sai in check online.
I'm sorry, should I continue? Ready?
Yeah, we have to mute whoever just joined. If you just joined, could you please make sure to mute yourself if you're not muted yet? Okay.
Okay, so if you think about the Castile shooting, the LeVar Jones shooting, these were not actually objectively threatening encounters. These were not encounters that would have led the civilian in this case to join any kind of arrest pool. So if you're just looking at the arrest pool, you're going to miss any kind of bias in genuinely non-threatening encounters. And I'll again, this is something to keep in mind. So it's one of the limitations of this study. But let me get to
a really quick question.
Yeah.
I might have missed it, but is the assumption that what bias refers to here is any deviations from parity across the two groups? So the probability of your facing police violence conditioned on a particular objective level of threat?
Yes, that's
okay,
exactly
so
what bias
from
yes,
equality conditioned on an objective level of threat, whatever that means.
That is what bias refers to. It refers to the same situation leading to a different response if you change only the race of the civilian. If so, in the Castile case, if it was a white civilian of roughly the same age, gender, with a girlfriend in the passenger seat, 4-year-old girl in the back, would there have been a lethal force incident? If not, then that's an incidence of bias. That's yeah.
Great. I think I agree with that account. I think that there's difficulty in thinking about why it should be relevant that it's an objective level of threat versus a subjective level of threat. Because if the reason that the police officer is engaging in is now like responding to the event,
yeah,
it's not the case. It's not the case that the police officer has access to sort of an objective level of threat.
Yes.
Right? Like they only have access to their subjective level of threat.
That's
and it's not clear to me why we're imposing this like extra burden on their part. Yeah.
Well, in fact, from a legal standard, it's the subjective level of threat that matters, as long as it's not unreasonable. So legally, that's why very few incidents of lethal force have led to successful prosecutions of officers is because the courts will look at the subjective level of threat, and as long as it's considered to be sincere, genuine, and reasonable, they are not usually, even in the Castile case, there was a trial, but the officer in that case, Geronimo Yanez, was acquitted at trial, precisely because it was deemed that the subjective level of threat was reasonable, even if it would have been different, even if there was no objective threat in that particular situation. So there's a legal standard, and then there's a standard conceptual sort of analytical standard that we need to think about whether or not we're trying to think about why is it that there's a disparity in the total incidence of lethal force. And one possible reason is that objectively threatening situations are treated differently. That's one possible explanation for the data. So there's value in thinking about it that way too, even if the courts don't always think of it that way. But can we come back to this point?
I totally agree with your account, and I agree we should think about objectively. I just wanted to point out that, I can see why legally this is happening, but I absolutely agree.
Yeah, exactly. Legally, it's the subjective level that really is primary. Yeah, exactly. As long as the officer can convince the jury that they were afraid for their own life or the lives of others, and unless it was preposterous, unless it was, it's just, the evidence just completely refutes that, they usually cannot be convicted. And so that's why we've seen such few convictions, in fact, and that's why you didn't have one in the Castile case. So let me continue. Now I'm going to talk about work from the book. So let me see, how much time do I have left? Maybe 15, 20 minutes, is that okay?
Yeah, 15, 20 minutes is perfect. We have until 2 o'clock, so we have 25 minutes for the presentation, but we can end.
Okay, good. So I think that's about right. I might finish a bit early even. So here's a table from the book actually that I mentioned with Dan, and here you see cities, different cities. These are the 5 largest cities in the United States, and here you see the rate of the likelihood of facing lethal force. This is the annual rate of civilian deaths per million population for 3 different groups: Black, Hispanic, and white, across different cities. And in each city, you see that the rate faced by African Americans is greater than that faced by Latinos, which is greater than that faced by white civilians. And that's true in every city. It varies from about 4 to 1. The black-white rate disparity is about 4 to 1 in Houston, and it's about 18 to 1 actually in Chicago. It's really huge in Chicago, but it's variable across cities. But the other thing that's you can see in this table, which I'd really like you to focus on, because I think that's one of the most important things that is neglected in the debate, is how large the deviations are, the absolute scale of deviations are across cities. So for example, Los Angeles and Houston have a lot more lethal force incidents than New York City, Chicago, and Philadelphia. So, and I'll show you that this is true for the country as a whole. These big differences show up, not just in cities, but in states. And if you look at the exposure to lethal force that whites face in Houston, 3.7 per million white population, it's actually larger than the threat of lethal force that African Americans face in New York City. So the regional scale differences are so large that sometimes they will even invert the differences, even though within each city you see racial disparities that are quite significant. If you just add all these cities together, you might get a very confusing picture. So for example, just to take an example, if you add together New York City and Houston and think of that as a particular sort of metropolitan region, and if it happens to be the case, and I know this is not true, but just as a thought experiment, if it happens to be the case that most African Americans live in New York City and most whites live in Houston, in that case, you'll see that for the consolidated metropolitan area, it'll look as if, in the area as a whole, it's whites who face more lethal force, when in fact, in both of the subregions, it's actually African Americans who face more lethal force. And this is an example of what's called Simpsons Paradox, where the aggregation can actually reverse something, reverse a ranking that arises in each of the subunits that you're aggregating. So I want to come back to this point. I think it's important to understand what's going on in the country today, and why the kind of national level arguments that were made by Sendil Mullainathan in the New York Times, the piece that I referred to a moment ago, can be very, very misleading. So I'll come back to that. Now, let's look at states. With regard to states, again, you see massive differences in exposure to lethal force across different states. The safest state for civilians in the Guardian data is Connecticut, and the most dangerous is New Mexico, right there at the bottom. Now, these are states with small populations. So you could say, okay, for 2015-16, maybe this is just random chance. But what really suggests that this is not just random chance is because these states have been color-coded in this figure based on their region. So the green color reflects the northeastern states. So that's New England plus New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. And then the yellow is the Midwest, the brown is South, and the western states are colored in red. And you can see that, all the northeastern states are really clustered at the top. These are low rates of exposure to lethal force. They actually look more like Europe. And then as you move, to the Midwest, it gets higher. South is even higher. But really the highest rates of lethal force are in the western states. And this is something to keep in mind when you add up across states and look at national data. It's important to keep in mind that the states are very different from each other. Now, they're different in other ways. So here's a figure. This goes back to the idea of preemption, the legal standard for use of force. You can ask, look, is it true that states in which officers are killed more often are also states in which civilians are killed more often? If you look at all the states together, there's a modest positive correlation. But if you just look at the states with the heaviest use of lethal force, so imagine in this slide, imagine a horizontal line at 6, in which more than 6 civilians are killed by police annually per million residents. All of these states are in the West and the South. In fact, they are all mostly in the West. So, you've got Wyoming, Oklahoma, Colorado, Nevada, DC, New Mexico, Arizona, West Virginia, and Alaska. Here, for this set of states, there seems to be virtually no connection between the threats faced by officers and the threats faced by civilians from officers. So that's one other fact that one can get from state-level data. Here's a different one, and here's another one that I think is extremely important when one thinks of aggregation. So if you look at the black share of the population, that's the horizontal axis here, as compared to the rate of lethal force faced by civilians. So the vertical axis is the same in all of these figures. And again, think of that horizontal line at 6, the states with the largest use of lethal force. All of them have Black populations that are below the national average, which is about 13%. So the highest is Nevada at about 9%. But New Mexico, Alaska, Oklahoma, Arizona, and the others are even below that. So every state in which you've got a massive amount of lethal force relative to the rest of the country happen to have small Black populations. And what that means is, that sort of thought experiment that I conducted with Houston and New York City may be very relevant. You may have bias in every state, including these states, but because the scale is so high in these Western states, when you add up across states, you might conclude that there is little bias or no bias, when in fact there may be bias in a large number of underlying states. So just keep that in mind. And then you can look at bias directly. So here you have, on the horizontal axis, you have Black fatalities per million Black residents. In the vertical, white fatalities per million white residents. And the steeper line here is a line with slope 1. And these are states where Blacks and whites face roughly the same likelihood of being victims of lethal force. Any state that is up above that steeper line, actually whites face a greater likelihood than Blacks. And then as you swing to the right, the flatter line, that is a 4-to-1 disparity, which is what we saw for Houston. That 4-to-1 disparity says, African Americans are 4 times as likely to face lethal force as whites. And if you swing beyond that to the states that are below that flatter line, those are states with very extreme levels of bias. So California, Utah, Colorado, Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin, and so on, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey. These are states where the disparity is more than 4-to-1, and then the rest of them between these two lines are either between parity and between 4-to-1. So that shows that there's a fair amount of variability also in the raw level of bias. Now, of course, some of these states have very small populations, so don't take this too seriously, especially for the small states. Okay, so how can we test? So what I'd like to finish up, I've got about 15 minutes left, and now I want to just talk about the sort of statistical econometric work that Dan and I are doing with Pepe Montilolia, who's an econometrician in the Columbia department. And we're trying to say, look, so we have this raw data. In fact, we have much better data now than I've presented to you. How can we see whether or not these patterns that appear in the data are just, by random chance? How likely is it that, there's some underlying deep difference across regions in the United States and across, across different victim groups regarding their likelihood of lethal force. So I'll give you two approaches to testing this, and it's very, very preliminary. So we don't have a working paper yet. We're at the early stages of this research. So I just want to give you an idea of the methodology and some preliminary results. But we are really at the beginning of a serious statistical analysis of this issue. So the first step was data assembly. So we took these media sources: Guardian, Washington Post, Fatal Encounters, Mapping Police Violence. These are four main sources of data on deadly force. And we tried to match incidents across them to construct one sort of universal data set, by matching incidents and making sure we avoid duplication, but trying to use data from all four sources. And then we limited attention to what we call standard police homicides, which are attributed to an on-duty officer and are a direct consequence of the officer taking action while seeking or pursuing a suspect. This is the situation in which most discussions of rightful or wrongful or biased use of force arise. And then we restrict further attention to what we call simple police homicides, which are standard but also refer to a police department as opposed to, let's say, a corrections agency, right? You can have lethal force incidents in prisons or with border patrol and so on, and we set those aside because we're particularly interested at the moment in differences across space in law enforcement agencies. And we also just restrict attention to killings that are deliberate rather than accidental. So if there's a vehicle chase and somebody dies in a crash, we don't want to include that. Or if it's self-inflicted, if somebody shoots themselves while they're surrounded, we drop that as well. Okay, so if we do that, if you look at the bottom row over here, so this is for, so we're trying to get as much data as we can. And the Guardian has just 2 years, but we managed to get 5 years from these four sources. And it's roughly consistent. Now, again, for the simple homicides, as I defined a minute ago, which involve a single law enforcement agency, it's about 1,000 a year. And so about 5,000 in total across all law enforcement agencies in the United States. And we want to try to understand how these are distributed across space and what's really going on that gives rise to these incidents, right? What can we say about these incidents, statistically? Well, there are a lot of agencies. So, some of them just have, maybe 1 or 2 officers, but there are, more than 21,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and more than 3,000 that were involved in at least lethal force incident over this period. Some of them, of course, with multiple incidents. But remember, it's a 5-year period. So, you had, some agencies necessarily may have had an incident in 1 year, but not in the others, and so on. The most lethal agencies account for about half of the killings, and the most lethal 1%, the most lethal 10% account for half the killings, the most lethal 1% for 20%. And this doesn't really mean a whole lot because the agencies are so different in size, right? If you're taking the, let's say the, Los Angeles Police Department or New York Police Department, they're much, much larger than you would find, let's say, in a small town. And so they're going to be skewed, just by construction. But I just present this data for your, just so that you have a sense of how skewed the shootings are, how many agencies are actually implicated. Okay, so now getting to the test, can we test the contact hypothesis? So I'll give you 2 approaches. So, one approach, which is more sort of conventional, is to say, look, suppose we have a measure of contact. So if you look at geographic variation in police homicides, the contact hypothesis says that this variation, which I've already shown you is extreme. It's very, very substantial across cities, across states. The contact hypothesis says that this should really reflect encounter rates or contact rates, that states with very high lethal force should have very high encounters after properly adjusting for threats faced. And I'll show you, how one might implement this approach and test this hypothesis using the Mullainathan Fryer standard, which is using arrest rates as a measure of contact. Now, I've already argued that arrest is a very poor measure of contact because it misses qualitative information, right? Because if the arrest pool for African Americans is swollen because of the inclusion of people who are not objectively threatening, then the arrest rates are not a proper measure of threat-adjusted contact. But let's suppose, just to illustrate the methodology, let's see what happens. if we use arrest rates as our measure of contact. So we're looking at a law enforcement agency level analysis. So let CJ be the contacts, which in this case is arrests, in law enforcement agency J. Let HJ be the police homicides. So those are the contacts that end up with somebody getting killed. And we have this data for J agencies, where capital J is a measure of the total number of agencies. And a very simple sort of starting point could be a statistical model, which basically says that each agency has a sort of a conversion rate, a likelihood of lethal force conditional on a contact. And we can denote this by PJ. So PJ is the probability of a homicide conditional on a contact in agency J, right? And we can, and the model simply says that the total number of homicides is a draw from a binomial distribution with the proportion parameter PJ and the total number of trials being CJ. And PJ is a law enforcement agency specific probability that an encounter will result in lethal force. And the Mullainathan-Fryer hypothesis, can be framed as follows. It basically says that there's a homogeneity of binomial proportions, that every law enforcement agency is basically the same in terms of how they convert contacts into killings. So PJ is equal to PJ prime for every pair JJ prime in the data. So that's one way to frame the contact hypothesis in a potentially testable way. So how can we test this? So the approach that we use is through the construction of simultaneous confidence bands for the vector valued parameter. So if you think about each of the binomial proportions P1 to P capital J as being a parameter vector, what we want to do is to construct confidence levels for each law enforcement agencies such that we can say with a certain amount of confidence that the entire parameter vector lies in the confidence band. So each individual binomial proportion lies in the individual confidence interval for the agency in question. So you're basically trying to construct these confidence intervals simultaneously for these agencies. And the key is if you set your alpha, so the last thing on the slide that you see before you, if 1 minus alpha is your confidence level overall, so you want to have, let's say, 95% confidence in your hypothesis, you have to find the appropriate beta, where beta is the individual confidence level for the law enforcement agencies in your analysis. And the difficulty that arises here is what's called the multiple comparisons problem, which of course, it's very well understood, is that the more agencies you look at, the more likely it is that, you're going to get extreme realizations just by chance. Like if you're looking at 20,000 agencies, you're going to find, some that have huge amounts of lethal force incidents just because, by chance, the realization was such that a huge number of contacts were converted into killings. And at the same time, you'll have some agencies where that didn't happen, even though you had a massive amount of contacts. None of them actually turned out, or very few of them turned out to involve killings, again, just by chance. So, we need to account for this possibility. And accounting for this possibility it has to be sensitive to how many law enforcement agencies are in your data set. So the larger the number of agencies, the smaller beta has to be for any given alpha. And there's a standard formula for making this adjustment, which is at the bottom of the slide over here. As J gets large, the right-hand side, the right-hand side of this expression approaches 1, and you've got to make beta really small. And that blows up the confidence intervals for each individual law enforcement agency. The more agencies you have, the wider the individual confidence intervals have to be in order for you to make a confident prediction that your full parameter vector actually lies in this sort of Cartesian product of intervals. So hopefully that was reasonably clear, and I'll just show you some results. And basically your test of the null hypothesis then becomes, is there a P star? Is there a binomial proportion that is common to all confidence intervals? So is there a P star that lies in every single one of these confidence intervals? If there is, then you don't reject the null hypothesis. If there isn't, then you can actually identify, if there's no such common P star, if some of these confidence intervals are disjoint, then you can actually identify which law enforcement agencies are causing a failure of homogeneity. In other words, you can you can actually tell, if we adopt this procedure, you can actually tell which agencies have unusually high, and others that have unusually low rates of lethal force, such that there's no common P to the two confidence intervals, right? And I'll just show you some results for that. So just using 2016 data, we have arrest information for 541 of the 643 agencies which had an incident. And we reject the contact hypothesis, but I want to show you actually the simultaneous confidence bands. This is for the 20 largest LEAs in the country in 2016 based on total arrests. And here's what we find. And these bands are very wide precisely because of the multiple comparisons problem. But what you see here, if you look on the left here, you see the NYPD has a particular confidence band. It's narrow because it's so large. There's so many arrests. And it does not intersect. There's no P star that is common to that and the confidence band on the extreme right, which is the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. So even though the latter interval is extremely large, this is just 1 year of data, there's no common P star. And if you look at Phoenix, it's somewhere in the middle, slightly to the left of middle. There again, it seems as if that there's no common binomial proportion that you could say can explain both the New York data and the Phoenix data, or both the New York data and the Los Angeles data. And so it tells you really which agencies are killing at rates that are significantly different from which other agencies. And New York here is low, Phoenix and Los Angeles are high. And the others you can't really tell because there's too much, there's too much statistical variation. Okay, so what about other agencies? So actually, if you just look at the entire set of 541 agencies, you'll find a difference between the NYPD, which is always on the low end. It wasn't always that way. But in these years, it's definitely on the low end of killings per contact. And Georgia State Patrol, which had 3 killings from 31 arrests. If you remove Georgia State Patrol, you still have California Highway Patrol that's significantly different from New York. Remove that one and you still get the LA County Sheriff's Department. Remember, California is one of these states with a lot of killings. And in fact, there's a couple in the news in the last couple of weeks alone. And one thing that we plan to do next, and I said this is very preliminary, but one thing we plan to do next is to construct these simultaneous confidence bands, but just restricting attention to each victim group, especially African Americans, Latinos, and whites separately, to see whether or not the differences across states, differences across law enforcement agencies, are similar across different victim group, or actually some agencies treat some groups better than other agencies in ways that differ across victim groups. So I think that was confusing. So let me just repeat that. We want to see, for example, the difference between California and New York that we're finding, between LA and New York that I just showed you on the previous slide. Is it primarily because the police agencies treat whites differently, or is it because they treat everybody differently? So that's the next step, and I don't have data on that. So let me wrap up. Oh, I'm almost out of time. Okay, so I have 2 minutes left. So let me just very quickly tell you a different approach. So we said that arrests are a very crude and very flawed measure of threat-adjusted contact. And we could, there's a lot of data that's in narrative reports, qualitative data that actually describes the incidents. And one approach to this is to, it's very high dimensional data, is to use a machine learning model, to use, a very standard LDA model to actually analyze the text. So to actually think about these narrative reports as arising from some relatively small set of latent factors that can allow these documents, these narrative reports, to be classified, and then for us to then carry out some tests on that classification. So let me very, very quickly show you some results. I won't go through the details of the LDA model. I just don't have time, but you're familiar with it probably. But basically what it does is it takes a corpus, it takes a whole bunch of documents, in this case narrative reports, and you assign to it, you choose a parameter which is the number of topics, so the number of latent topics from which these narrative reports are drawn. The basic idea is that each document is a distribution over topics, and the way in which the document is constructed is there's a draw from that distribution over topics, and then each topic is a distribution over words or phrases, and each document is constructed by a series of draws first a topic is drawn from the distribution over topics, and then a word is drawn from the distribution over words. And if you estimate this model, and this is done for, again, this is for the Guardian data, there are 3 topics. So we impose the parameter 3. We say, okay, estimate this model for 3 topics. And you can see that there's a sort of meaningful latent topic emerging. So if you look at topic 2, you see a lot of words that are related to traffic stops, vehicle, car, suspect, stop, drive, flee, pull. And then if you look at topic 1, it looks like a call for service at a home. You've got words like home, respond, call, and so on. In fact, they're listed over here. So topic 2 has a lot of vehicle-related terms. Topic 1 has a lot of words like residence, neighbor, respond, domestic, and so on.
Could I jump in with a quick question?
Yeah.
So a lot of topic modeling is useful for like, if these were things that you wouldn't be able to just sort of like manually do, right? I think if you hadn't told me about these topics, I would have expected probably there's something that's just like asking for help, and there's some things that are like related to vehicles. So maybe not quite as surprising, but I just want to get a sense of like, how many documents do you have, like, approximately, and also how long is each document, like approximately how many words per document?
So we have police for the lethal force incidents. We have about 5,000 documents. That's the the data I showed you earlier for the 5 years, about 1,000 killings per year. And each, because these are media reports, the document is really coming from, a sort of summarized version of the media report. They vary a lot in the total number of words, and some of them have relatively few words, maybe 20, maybe 25, and some of them are longer. But you also have, and this is the point I wanted to make just in conclusion, you also have very detailed narratives for law enforcement officers killed. So there's a database called the LEOCA database, the law enforcement officers killed and assaulted. And there, they actually have a manual classification. So exactly as you said, they actually classify, I think they have an 11 or maybe 15, I think it's 11-way classification of killings where the victim is the officer. And there you have more detailed narrative reports, and you already have a classification, even without topic modeling. You already have a classification of those homicides. And so what we want to do in future research, and again, I just want to stress that this is very preliminary. What we want to do in future research is to ask the following questions, which are at the bottom of the screen. Are the topic distributions different for different regions? So if you estimate this, if this topic model for the country as a whole, do you find that most of the killings, let's say in California or Arizona, are coming at traffic stops, while most of those, let's say in Alabama or Mississippi, are coming at calls for service to the home? That's a question that one can ask once one estimates this model. Another question is, are the topic distributions different for different victim groups? So is it true that people who are African American are being killed, under different circumstances than people who are Latino or people who are white? And finally, what's the connection between the topic distribution, for the lethal force incidents involving the killing of civilians, and the topic distribution of the narratives that are in the LEOCA database? If we estimate the topic model by pooling together all of these incidents, how close is the connection between, the topic distributions for the narratives when police are killed to the topic distributions for the narratives when civilians are killed? And in particular, is it the case that, for different racial and ethnic groups, the civilian victimization and the police victimization are close or far apart to different degrees? So, for example, is it the case that white civilians are mostly killed in circumstances that are similar to circumstances in which police themselves are killed, or not? Those are the kinds of questions one could ask. And again, we're at a very, very early stage of this. So please treat these as speculative remarks and the estimation as being very, very preliminary. And I think I should stop because I'm out of time, but this is, in case you're interested, this is my book with Dan. It's coming out actually on Monday, I think the 15th of April. And the early data that I presented, the one with the geographic distribution, those charts, where I showed you the distribution across states and the cities, that's contained in one of the chapters of this book, if you want to go deeper into that, as well as into the qualitative and historical and anecdotal evidence. So I should stop, otherwise we won't have any time for discussion. We've only got 11 minutes left. Sorry about that.
No, this was really great. Thank you so much for covering.
I'm going to stop, Radiate, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Did I succeed?
Yes, you did. You did. Now we can see your face. So,
okay.
yeah, no, that was really wonderful. Thank you for the discussion. So I have some questions, but I want to give priority to others who haven't spoken yet. Are there any thoughts or questions, comments?
There's a clarification question from the YouTube stream. So the question is, where are your narrative reports coming from that you used to do the text analysis? And it sounded like they were coming from media reports, news reports. And the question was asking whether police officer reports were used. If not, would they provide sort of a different, set of topics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are 4 sources for the narratives. There's the Guardian database, the Washington Post, Fatal Encounters, and Mapping Police Violence, and each of these has reports on these incidents. Some are more limited than others. And what we do is to try to consolidate these and try to get the richest narrative that we can. But ultimately, they are really based on media reports, the local media reports, and there's no standard for this. So media reports from a local newspaper, let's say, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, may not be the same as, in Milwaukee. And they're applying their own standards, and even their standards may not be consistent across different incidents, because you're gonna have a different reporter assigned to it. So there's a lot of, so it's a perfectly fair question, but that's what we're using for the narrative reports for the lethal force incidents. The narrative reports from LEOCA, which I didn't show you any estimates for that data is much more standard. So that's coming from individual law enforcement agencies as reported to the FBI, and they have an 11-way classification system. So as somebody said, maybe it was you, I wasn't able to see, but as somebody said, you use topic modeling often when you can't do a manual classification. Well, the LEOCA data has a manual classification. And one of the things that we want to do is to estimate the topic model and say, look, does it actually match the manual classification? That'd be something worth seeing. But those are much more standard, and those are coming from police. But that's because those are incidents where the police officer himself or herself was killed. So those are much more standard. But yeah, the narrative reports are from all over the place with a whole bunch of different criteria.
And a follow-up question to that from the same question asker was, are there possibly other sources of data which would, are there ways that we could use the techniques from social computing to help gather such data?
We could in principle, but so the Fryer study, in fact, that I mentioned before, actually used in constructing the arrest pool, they used actual police reports, incident reports for the particular arrest. That's how they classified the arrest categories and tried to. One of the variables that I mentioned to you was whether or not the civilian was attacked or drew weapon, right? That was one of the variables that he had coded, and that was coded using manually, actually, with a whole bunch of arrays without using social computing, was coded manually. But one could, in principle, do that too, except that that's not available online. It's not easily readable, but and he had to go through great lengths to get the police department to pass on those records, and that's why his work is for Houston, because Houston did it, and the others didn't. Yeah.
I like the implication of the question, the set of questions that was just asked, which is that can we also study whether there are differences in how, say, like large national newspapers would cover an incident versus, say, local newspapers that might be where like the news, where the journalists might be, different demographics, or might have like intimate knowledge of the local nuances that exist and stuff like that. That would be, it's sort of orthogonal to what you're looking at, but I think it would also be very interesting to see.
it's highly relevant. It's a sort of independent research question in its own right that's worth looking at. In general, about reporting about anything. Actually, it could be about sexual assault, for example, or or corruption. That's a very interesting question. How do sort of small local sources differ from large national and global sources? But we should also take it into account when we do our narrative reports. We should also take into account the fact that we're, I critiqued aggregation,
right?
And this is a kind of aggregation that we are doing that could also be critiqued, which is aggregating across different narrative report types. And I take that point. That's a very valid concern.
Yeah, and also just comparing it also to how people are talking about it, say online, right, on just like Twitter or something. Also, would be.
Yeah. Yeah, so Twitter, of course, that's been mined a lot for data, but I just wonder how much of this will actually appear on Twitter. Some of these incidents are, then there's going to be a strong sort of random component as to whether this incident is mentioned at all. Some of them will be mentioned hundreds or thousands of times, as in the Orlando Castile that was sort of broadcast on Facebook Live, but we'd miss a lot of incidents. They may have no Twitter sort of appearance at all. But yeah, worth thinking about. Yeah.
I have a question about your beginning part on implicit bias. It seemed as though you were offering a potential hypothesis or some sort of empirical phenomenon to support the fear hypothesis.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of follow-up experiments on the implicit association stuff that shows that, your extent of implicit bias in these tests doesn't actually correspond to any changes in discriminatory behaviors, like the actual link between the kind of biases that you harbor and the biases that you actually exhibit, are different. Does that change your interpretation of the fear hypothesis if you take into on your view?
So that's a very, very good and very important question. I'm really glad you asked that, and it's very controversial. So the advocates of the IAT, Mazreen, Banerjee, Greenwald, they argue that there are that the test has strong behavioral predictors, but there's one study out of Spokane, and this is discussed in the book, actually. So we actually address this question because it's such an important question. We address it in the book, and there's one study out of Spokane where police officers were tested, and they showed, fairly significant implicit bias, but at the same time, when they were asked to, asked to use simulators, sort of very sort of realistic scenarios, unfolding scenarios, where they were asked to shoot people, basically like in a video game, if they were holding a weapon, and to not shoot them if they were holding a harmless object. There was no connection in this particular study out of Spokane between the implicit bias, which they showed in the lab tests, and the actual behavior where they revealed the opposite. They were more reluctant to shoot sort of simulated black victims in this scenario than to shoot white victims, conditional on a firearm being in play. And this is, again, just one study. I didn't have time to discuss it. It's discussed in the book. This is a raging debate in psychology. I mean, that's what motivates your question. There are folks like, I think, Paul Tetlock and others who say that, one ought not to draw behavioral implications from the IAT. And there are others who say that you should. I just wanted to present to you one set of arguments that's advanced to support the fear hypothesis. I didn't want to make a judgment on that one way or the other. But it is part of the debate. It's part of the discussion. So I thought I would just cover that ground briefly at the beginning. But that's not my research at all. That's Banerjee, Greenwald, and social psychology. There's a whole chapter on this in our book, but it's a survey chapter. It's not our own research.
That makes sense. Are there?
That's an important question, and I'm glad somebody asked that question. That's important.
Good. Are there any sort of final questions? We have a couple of minutes before we should wrap up. All right, it looks like we don't, so let's just thank the speaker. Thank you so much, Professor.
Sorry, can I ask one small question?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm
Please.
just so interested in in these topics generally. So it seems like a lot of the methodology seems to be motivated by a particular statistical artifact, namely that the null hypothesis is usually that we expect certain rates to be equal across groups. So, if we observe deviations between groups, then we ought to find reason, and the reason can be due to bias or it can be due to previous other factors. And I think what you're pointing out, which is a very key point, is that in fact the groups are not different, or I'm sorry, they are different potentially, because the population of Black Americans who are being arrested is over inclusive.
Yes,
So
yes.
I'm wondering whether this seems to point to a fundamental issue in our conceptualization of null hypotheses as always being based on some sort of parity without having addressed this substantive normative view. And I'm wondering what are ways that people working in the quantitative sciences can deal with this statistical reason for a lot of these errors.
Yeah, that's another really great question. I totally agree with you. I feel that this is so important and so neglected. Because the folks who do qualitative work, who actually look at detailed incidents and narratives, don't really communicate with the ones who do statistical work, who jump very quickly to hypothesis testing and estimation. And that is why actually I presented the null hypothesis in this presentation as being one about geography and not about race or ethnicity. So it was really about, the null hypothesis here was about binomial proportions for different law enforcement agencies pooling together all victim groups. So I didn't give you any kind of test of a discrimination hypothesis when I discussed the null hypothesis here. And we will eventually get there, but we need to be much more careful because, exactly because of the reasons you mentioned, precisely because the qualitative differences between the arrest pools, and even if the arrest pools weren't different in terms of the initiation of contact, they play out in different ways. So there's a lot of this discussed in the book. I hope some of you will pick it up and read it because, for example, with regard to the Gates arrest, so the officer on the scene was James Crowley. He arrested Gates. There was this beer summit at the White House with Obama, Biden, and Crowley and Gates, and there was an African American officer called Leon Lashley who showed up at the scene a little bit later. And he was interviewed on CNN and Anderson Cooper's show, and he said, "Look, I stand by Crowley. I'm his colleague." He said, he did the right thing. He didn't do anything wrong. But if I had shown up on the scene first, things would have played out differently. So Anderson Cooper said, "What do you mean? If he did everything right, then why would things have played out differently if you showed up on the screen first?" And he didn't say why. He just said, "Oh, black man to black man, it would have just turned out differently." And you can think about how the interaction can turn out very, very differently. Even if Lashley had been first on the scene and done exactly what Crowley did, Gates would have been less inclined to think that he was racist and that he was doing this just to basically use his power to intimidate an elderly, frail African American. And beliefs of people interact in ways everybody. The way we put it in the book is that whenever you have an interaction, two people bring their own life histories to that interaction, and they don't really know much about each other. And the entire way in which that interaction plays out is conditioned on these life histories. And if you don't take those into account, a lot of terrible things can happen, both in the incident itself and in the subsequent analytical treatment of these things, which is the point you were making. So I can't even begin to emphasize how important I believe these things are, and they are discussed over and over again in the book. But people doing statistical analysis of this have got to sit and pay attention to these kind of qualitative differences. You're preaching to the choir here. I am completely convinced of that.
That's a really great note to end on, I think. Thank you so much for speaking to us and sharing your work. And thank you for all the great questions from everyone. The video is going to be on the YouTube, so feel free to watch it and email us any thoughts or questions. And with that,